Charged Up Episode 2, Professor Arshad Ahmad, Becoming Financially Literate.
Are you ready to get charged up about your money, your credit, and your overall financial health? You've come to the right place. You're listening to Charged Up with Jenny Hoff.
Welcome to Charged Up. I'm your host, Jenny Hoff. This month, I'm all about tackling debt. And one important tool in that is understanding what debt is, how we got into it, and how we can avoid it in the future. That falls under the camp of being financially literate. So who better to teach us about how to become financially literate than a professor who has been in the business of teaching about finance for 25 years? Professor Arshad Ahmad is the Associate Vice President of Teaching and Learning at McMaster University. He's been a finance professor for 25 years. He also teaches a course on finance and debt on Coursera, which offers free courses taught by top professors from around the world. So if you really want to become financially literate, then I highly recommend checking it out. Coursera courses are usually free to view and come with a small fee if you want to take tests or get certified. So let's get charged up to become financially literate. Financial literacy, for people who've never heard that term before, is really about understanding something that affects your lives in a very deep way. We all know that money affects us, debt affects us, our finances affect us, and yet many of us, especially when I've read Dr. Ahmad's descriptions of financial literacy, I will say many of us probably are not totally literate in finances and really don't understand where our money's going and how to best use our money. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ahmad.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You talk about financial literacy in your work. Can you explain what that means at a personal level? What should we know to consider ourselves financially literate?
Yeah, what is financial literacy? Very simply stated, it's about money. It's about understanding money, how it flows, and having the confidence to manage it. And really, when we think about money, there are, well, let's say two kinds of money. Your money, which is debt, and my money, which is equity. So if we just keep that in mind, someone else's money and your own money, or debt and equity, at a personal level, to be financially literate, I think you need to be able to do some basic things without getting into definitions and stuff like that. Rather than saying most people might be financially illiterate, let's just say what financial literacy might involve and how people might be engaged with it. Mm-hmm. So let me give you some examples of what I meant by basic things. So be able to do basic things. Ask yourself if you can come up with a personal balance sheet on a back of a napkin in 2 minutes. This would say what you own, what you owe, and the difference, which would be equity. So that would be one thing. What about, say, talking to an expert, like a banker, who's probably someone you visit or used to visit, unless you're doing everything online, and understand questions about your own borrowing capacity. How much can you borrow so that you can also sleep well and not just thinking about eating well? This is something I'll come back to about sleeping well and eating well. There's a big trade-off we make in decisions that allow us to do more of one, trading off with the other. Another thing about your credit card, that people will use this tool in order to get things because it's seasonal right now to use credit cards and then maybe go off to a point where we have these regrets. And if we have regrets, we better insure against them. So there's a whole bunch of decisions about managing risk that come with making financial decisions. And then let's not forget, throughout the year, and this is not something we should do at one point in time, which many people actually do, which is to make investments. So if you have money, if you're not borrowing, and you're making some investments, are you able to evaluate your decisions? And if you don't want to make those decisions, well, someone else is going to make them for you. Do you have the confidence to evaluate their decisions? And think about some notions of planning. We're all getting older. I certainly am. And so what about retirement? That's another huge part of financial literacy. So, all of these involves decision making. And at some point in time, you're either directly engaged in making these or someone else is. And so I guess that's how I would define it. Being able to do those kinds of things.
That's a pretty hefty list. So what percentage of Americans would you say are financially literate? We take on mortgages, credit cards, we have retirement funds, as you said. All these finances impact our lives in a big way. Do we know what we're doing?
I don't have the figures for US handy, but I'd ask everyone who's listening to the podcast about their own circle of family and friends. How many people in this circle would you trust to have a handle on the types of financial decisions that I just mentioned? And my guess would be that not that many. And if you do look at surveys, there's one on global financial literacy that McGraw-Hill came up with, and they suggest that 2 out of 3 people around the world are basically financially illiterate.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. And I think in my own circles, I would say that's not exaggerating in the least. Part of the problem for most people is that these decisions are really not that interesting. I mean, they're not something you get up with and go, hey, I can't wait to figure out my insurance choices, or, to compare credit cards, or I can't wait to have that conversation with the banker, or make my personal balance sheet or a retirement plan. This is not intrinsically very interesting. And maybe it's because, if we dig deeper a little bit, because people associate financial literacy with, let's say, math or quantitative skills. And a lot of people, if you ask them, hey, do you like math? And a lot of people will say, sorry, that's one area I don't feel very confident about. And please don't talk to me about numeracy skills. And maybe, unfortunately, relating it to the kind of jargon they also encounter. Money matters are more in our mind's eye, and is something that we face because of, let's say, the following couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that for individuals, the median income, this is like if you take all the levels of income and you go right in the middle, those levels of income have decreased, if not stagnated. People are earning less. Add to this cheap money. We've never had it better in terms of money being so cheap, and that's reflected in the interest rates. So when you have an abundance of cheap money and not enough income coming in, what are you going to do? You're just going to borrow. And when you borrow more and more and more, that's when money matters stare you in the face. And so when you start having this dependency on debt, to answer your question, when you take on more and more debt, and when financial institutions and governments are behaving even more recklessly than you are, then financial literacy takes on a new meaning. And yes, it seems that the system no longer has the kind of checks and balances. It does appear we don't know what we're doing.
As you said, there's this general feeling that it's cheap to borrow money. And that's when people get themselves into trouble, because they borrow money, say, especially if you borrow money on credit cards and you associate small interest rates, which are what we see with mortgages and what you get at the bank for your savings. And you think, well, I can borrow as much as I want. And then you face the high interest rates that credit cards offer, and you find yourself in a hole that you can't dig out of. What is the debt that people should be very aware of, and what can they do to avoid getting themselves into a hole like that?
Whether the source is credit cards, auto loans, student loans, whatever it might be, you're in a situation that you find yourself in, what are you going to do about it? Well, it's like finding yourself that you're not feeling really good. How are you going to start feeling better? And I mean health-wise, if that's the analogy we're going to use here for a moment. I think when we encounter this kind of no-win situation, people have to sort of think about the real symptoms or the deeper issues. They have to tackle those issues if they're going to change things in the long run. In the short run, they might be able to do a whole bunch of stuff to help themselves. But, short-run fixes are only going to result in a short-run fix. They're not going to solve the problem. They're going to put a Band-Aid just so that you can get through the day or get through the week or get through the month. So we have to think about attitudes. We have to think about beliefs. So we can talk about the short run or the long run. Let's start with the short run. I would suggest that you start with a group of people that you trust, a group of family or friends who are going to support you. And what I mean by support right now is you need the emotional support as you find some of the more technical sort of responses or answers you'll get from, say, a financial advisor. But before you go to the financial advisor, have someone else that you trust that you can speak to about your conversations with the financial advisor. So I think of this as an approach that is reasonable in being able to look in the mirror where you have someone to speak to. You need to look in the mirror when you have a problem like this. And looking in the mirror doesn't often happen with a financial advisor. They're just going to tell you what to do, perhaps. And you may find that very unreasonable. But if you have someone else in your life at this point in time that is going to unpack the kind of issues you're dealing with, it becomes a lot easier.
When you say looking in the mirror, what do you mean by that? Is it confronting perhaps bad habits that we may have that we repeat over and over? What do you mean when you say look in the mirror?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I mean. I hate to say this, but, debt is almost like an addiction. But people label that as a bad thing. But we're all falling into all kinds of addictions, whether it's food addictions, chocolate addictions. Doing something in excess is an addiction that you can't help. And you find yourself, I'm doing it again, I can't seem to get out of this. That's addictive. Now, that without really exploring the psychological and, the kind of medical ways of dealing with addiction, this has to do with habits and changing attitudes and changing the ways in which we go about dealing with money. Let's come back to that. So you may get a technical answer to the kind of issue you confront with, say, credit cards. You have too many credit cards, too many bills. Someone tells you, consolidate your debt. But you may be able to do that and have then one credit card and come up with a rescheduling plan that your financial expert suggests to you. And then along with it, rework your budget perhaps to come up with a short-term solution. So you can make that payment and move on. But that's not going to solve your problem. Because you got here, not because, you had a short-term problem. You got here because you're constantly faced with this problem. And when I say you, I mean me, I mean us. Mm-hmm. I mean, many of us are in the same boat. So it's not like, someone picked you out and said, you're a bad person, and that's why you're in this soup. As I explained earlier on, there are systemic issues that have led a lot of us into this particular dilemma. So we're all facing it for a number of reasons. I mentioned income, I've mentioned cheap money, etc. But now that we find ourselves in this situation, how are we going to get out of it? And if we're going to recognize it's an addiction, well, I think any addict will tell you, me included, that you've got to start off by, looking in the mirror. Looking in the mirror means admitting you've got an issue and talking to someone about it. And if you want to defeat that, you have to work with attitudes. You have to work with emotions. You have to work with some lessons learned. Lots of scars that will help. Lots of mistakes that were made need to be talked about. That's really important. People kind of ignore that and say, that doesn't apply to me. That applies to someone I saw in a movie or someone else's story. But this is your story, and there's a lot of wisdom in that kind of learning.
Do you think these are habits? Because you mentioned in an article written for the Huffington Post about how financial literacy is a little bit like dieting. We all know the steps that we have to take, and yet there's simple steps that we have to take, like not spending money on your credit card, but we don't do them. And so are we more impulse driven where it is harder to change our habits than we think? Can we change? Are we changeable in that sense? Because I think a lot of people say, I've spent a lot of money. They cut up their credit cards once they've paid them off. And lo and behold, a year later, they're signing up for new credit cards and repeating the same mistakes. I've seen it happen in family and friends and people that I know. So are we changeable? And if we are changeable, how do we actually make that change?
Well, this is really addressing the core issue of, change. And I would go back to the example you just gave, and I often give this one. I love to eat French fries. I have to tell you, I'm sharing the secret with you. I love French fries. But I know if I have a few of them, I'm going to be okay. But if I'm going to eat them every single day and gorge on them,
right,
I'm going to have a problem. I already have a weight problem. Now, if I have a weight problem, how do you tackle that? It's the same way in which we're going to tackle our financial well-being problem. It's the same thing, really. Now, if you're going to get a diet or if you're going to get some prescription from somewhere, which you can also get for your financial problem, that doesn't change things. So what do? Well, you work on the things that are going to help you to change. One of them is motivation. And the other thing is to be able to sustain that motivation, right? So something as simple as, I'm going to suggest something. Someone convinces you that if you drink 5 liters of water a day, your hormonal balance will change. Your definitely going to have weight loss. And in fact, your circulation will change. A lot of good things will happen if you just increase the amount of water you drink every day. And you might say, convinced, I'm going to do it. Well, are you going to do it? How are you going to do this? You might say, I'm going to unlock the way of drinking 1 liter more water each month. Not even each day. I'm going to give myself a month so I can have 1 liter more water until I've hit that 5-liter mark. There you go. You've taken a step towards your well-being with your diet.
Right.
That was just drinking water, right? One example. Same things we have to think about with our money. There are several examples like these where we start changing our habits. You change your habits by thinking about doing something that's going to become enjoyable rather than, going to the dentist. Financial habits have to change in the same way our well-being for health habits change. And they have to do with thinking more of the positive that is going to reinforce your changes rather than dwelling in the negative that get you depressed, that get you really emotionally anxious, and that make you feel helpless. So turning that piece around has to do with the kind of emotional changes that are as important as taking the steps for being financially independent.
So a lot of it is actually just releasing that anxiety, because it's a little bit of this cycle where you think about your finances, you think about your debt, you get anxious about it, whether you have too much money, too little money, too much debt, too little debt, whatever it is, you get anxious, and you often then do detrimental things because you're trying to make yourself feel better. So what are some ways that we can look at it positively and help get rid of our debt or change those habits? Is it every time you don't spend money, you treat yourself to something you like? I mean, what are some ways that people can just stop repeating the same mistakes over and over again?
I think you can do small things. I gave the example of drinking more water. You can do small things with money, like, hey, how about making that personal balance sheet? Just trying to figure out, where am I at right now? How much am I worth? What do I have? What am I borrowing? And what is my equity, if anything? I may have negative equity. So you got to take stock first. But when you take stock, one of the problems of taking stock is we don't have the tools, we don't have the language, and we don't have the people around us to do this activity. So set that up. Talk with people, get literate. There has never been a better time than today in acquiring really fantastic information that are really at everyone's fingertips. Literally, or your mobile phone will give you that information. Your laptop certainly will. If that doesn't work for you, go to your library. They will have these tools where you can get this info. So choose a good course that's going to at least give you a roadmap. And, don't worry so much about tips and tricks. The short-term things are not going to change your attitudes. Your attitude is going to change by, first of all, having a reflection. I mean, that's one thing I would advise to every single person. Find out why you are where you are. What are some of the deeper reasons? Is it because, and let me give you a few examples. I've done this a lot with my own students and with myself. What was your attitude towards money when you were younger? We were all introduced to money at some stage in our life. Was it talked about in a healthy way around the dinner table? Was it a taboo subject? Those reflections are really important. Try and unpack why you have this kind of inertia, inhibition about talking about money like you would about your own health. And once you start having this kind of discourse and you start looking at some courses, I'll mention my own here because I've spent 25 years of my life trying to help people in navigate through some of these basic decisions that I talked about. So you can start getting more confidence with the language. You need a language to be able to tackle financial illiteracy. You need to be able to listen to someone else who's giving you advice and cut through all of the nonsense so you can make sense, just common sense, out of money coming in, money going out. Where is your cash flow? There are so many apps that can help you track that. It doesn't mean that you sit down and create this long budget that already makes you feel like you're going to the dentist. Do one little thing. Do one little thing and open the conversation so you create a learning environment for yourself. Create the conditions so you're going to succeed. Those conditions you control. The other stuff will take time. There's no such thing as substitute for practice. So you start practicing few things that become under your control. So you can explain to someone how much you own, how much you owe, what are your loans. Focus on your loans for a moment. Where did they come from? What are you going to do with the particular loan that is constantly a source of frustration for you? What are some of the possible solutions? What lifestyle changes do they imply? What does it mean that, maybe the big house you have, you could live in a smaller house? Does it mean that the car that you drive alone could be, your transportation issue could be solved in a different way? What are those life changes that you need to make? Those life changes are going to be the keys that unlock the so-called constraints that you face, because there's always a solution. It's a question of how you approach it. It's a question of how you equip yourself to deal with it, and please don't do it alone.
I think that's really, really good advice. Open up the conversation. Take stock of how you view finances. Make a simple balance sheet. How much do you owe to somebody? How much are you bringing in? And is it negative? Do you owe a lot of money that you can't afford to pay off? And what life changes can you make to start lowering those payments? So just so that we all feel better, have you ever made a bad financial decision that you came to regret? And what would you have done differently?
Hey, not only have I made in retrospect, I'm still making them. That's part of being human, right? I mean, just because you have knowledge doesn't mean that, you figured out what is really a sort of a wicked issue. I mean, money is something that you can deal with. It doesn't mean that you've solved it forever and ever. It just doesn't work like that. Even if you have lots of money, people are very sad with their financial decisions, even when they have a lot of money. And we know that from all the people who win money, for example, through lotteries and so on, end up being really miserable many, many times. And you might be saying, what an idiot. He's telling me, if I had $1 million tomorrow, all my problems would go away. Well, frankly speaking, the evidence says otherwise. So I'll give you my own example. One of my first big mistakes was overpay for a house. I just overpaid. Why did I overpay? Now, when I think about this mistake, I did that because in a way it was an identity issue. I wanted to live in a certain place, impress certain kind of people I hung out with, and I was thinking about my family that, they need this kind of space, they need these kinds of amenities and so on and so forth. I had an excuse. I had so many excuses to spend very quickly the kind of money I did to buy this house, not realizing that it was something I couldn't really afford.
Right.
I mean, it was because I could borrow money and there was a future of earning more income. But that's the typical mistake people make. They get over-optimistic and they are not hard-nosed about the money that's coming in. There's a reason when our parents and our grandparents told us to live within your means. What the heck does that mean? It means that you don't work morning till night, doing 10 jobs so that you can pay your debts. That's just insanity. And I mean, saying that, I'll pay my bills because I'll just get another job. You're going to ruin your health along the way if you do that. That's just not good common sense. And I think that's when I say we need to step back and review our decisions that we made and be honest about it. I'll admit, I've done that on so many occasions. I still do it.
That's great. And that's a great note to end on, and talking about really thinking bigger than just your next payment or your next credit card payment or your next bill, but it's more about your overall satisfaction in life and how do you view money? How do you view what you're spending and why are you spending what you're spending? Finally, before we go, what charges you up about personal finance, about educating people?
What charges me up is to attend to those gaps, is to remind people that there's so much we can do. Ask, what is really going on here? What's the big question? Just like the questions you asked me today, Jenny, they were excellent questions. They got me talking. I don't talk as much, by the way, normally. I am very excited right now speaking to you because you asked good questions. Well, what are the good questions that you're going to ask yourself about money-related issues? When you ask a good question, answers are much easier. If you ask a bad question, you're going to get bad answers. But that requires thinking, it requires practice, it requires informing yourself, it requires listening to others and creating this kind of a social network where you feel you have some significant people in your lives who you can talk to and influence. And that's what I'm trying to do in my own little way as a teacher.
And for people who want to learn about finance, you have a course on Coursera, which is a website where you can get free courses. You can at least sit in and listen to the free courses and watch them. Or if you pay a little bit of money, you can become certified, take the tests, etc. And you have a course called Finance for Everyone where you cover issues like debt.
Absolutely. It's about literacy. The whole course is to, it's not just for personal finance. It's not just for people working in a business. It's not just for people in NGOs or not-for-profit places. It's the kind of tools you need to be able to have the conversation so that you can do stuff for yourself and empower yourself to ask those good questions and to be able to take those next steps. So you're better informed and, you're looking after yourself and you're looking after the ones that you want to serve and that you love.
Thanks for joining us today. It's been a very fascinating discussion and we learned a lot.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and I hope I can learn more from your good questions.
And thank you for joining me for this episode of Charged Up, How to Become Financially Literate. Every week, I'll be interviewing experts within the CreditCards.com family or authors or inspirational individuals who can teach you about money stewardship and how to become financially successful. Remember, this isn't just about money. This is about life. If we can control our anxiety around money and learn to master it, we can start controlling other aspects of our life as well and learn how to enjoy it a little bit without having to swipe our credit card all the time. If you have questions that you want me to address on the show, shoot me an email at chargedup@creditcards.com. And don't forget to rate or review Charged Up with Jenny Hoff on iTunes. Let's get charged up about your financial future.